May 1998. After almost 2 full years since the release of Tekken 2, Tekken 3 would finally be releasing in North America, and to celebrate, a group of fans were holding a tournament at the local Waffle House. 7 hours in, and of the 12 people that had entered, it was down to you and one other player. Not like you were scared, of course. The Waffle House manager once again sternly reminded you to hurry up and finish your stupid tournament, as your gamer BO was making it hard to get any customers. You looked at her with a devilish grin, and assured her that this would only take a matter of minutes. It was time for Grand Finals, and to send whatever unlucky loser left to face you home in a body bag. Your opponent then takes their seat next to you, and grabs their controller. Suddenly, the entire atmosphere in the room changed, and with it, so did your confidence. Your opponent had a powerful aura, one that you had felt before, and so, you turned to see who it was. Oh god, it's Josh! Josh was your childhood friend and long-standing rival for years, and you have never been able to take a single round off of him. Now, he sits before you as your final opponent in the Waffle House Tekken 3 Invitational. He looks kindly at you and tells you he's looking forward to a fun match. You turn back toward the screen and prepare yourself. Even though your lifetime record against Josh is 0 to 7,134, it didn't matter. With a crowd of 10 other players and a random Waffle House employee cheering you on, you knew that this would be the day that Josh finally tastes defeat. Unlike Tekken 2, which had come out in arcades less than a year after the original, Tekken 3 wouldn't be released for almost 2 full years in arcades before coming out on the PlayStation in different regions throughout 1998. But when Tekken 3 finally did release, it was massively successful. Selling over 8 million copies and bringing in a legion of lifetime fans, Tekken 3 redefined what a 3D fighting game could be with an iconic and distinct lineup of characters, a fire soundtrack, and a satisfying continuation of the plot from the previous game. Tekken 3 isn't just considered one of the best fighting games of all time. To many, it's one of the best games of all time. And with that all being said, it is once again time to dive into the not at all convoluted and unhinged story of Tekken. 15 years have passed since Heihachi Mishima defeated his son Kazuya in the second King of Iron Fist tournament by throwing Kazuya into a volcano, killing him, and allowing Heihachi to once again take control of the Mishima Zaibatsu. Now once again in control of the corporation, Heihachi establishes a new private army known as the Tekken Force. Not long after, a Tekken Force squad is conducting a search of an ancient temple in Central America before being completely wiped out by a mysterious being. Heihachi then learns that this mysterious being is none other than the god of fighting himself, Ogre. Heihachi, being the deranged psychopath that he is, believes if he can capture Ogre, then he can use the god's power for himself. After Ogre's awakening, martial artists from around the world begin to vanish without a trace. Meanwhile, 15 years earlier, Jun Kazama, one of the competitors in the second King of Iron Fist tournament, at some point had gotten with the sponsor of the tournament, Kazuya Mishima, and went and did some stuff. And now, 15 years later, was living alone on a small island with her and Kazuya's son, Jin Kazama. After learning about the recent disappearances of martial artists at the hands of Ogre, and knowing he could come for her as well, Jun begins training her son in the Kazama fighting style, and tells him if anything ever happens to her to seek out his grandfather, Heihachi. Not long after, in the dead of the night, Ogre attacks. Jin attempts to fight him off, but is knocked unconscious. Upon waking up, he finds his home destroyed and his mother missing, and believes her to be dead. And as it turns out, Jin is actually a carrier of the devil gene, just like his father, and without the protection of Jun, it is able to manifest and marks his left arm. As instructed by his mother, Jin seeks out Heihachi and reveals that he is his grandson, tells him of Ogre's attack, and asks to be taught a way to defeat him. Heihachi, being the deranged psychopath that he is, decides to teach Jin the Mishima fighting style and plans to use him as bait to bring out Ogre. 4 years later, on Jin's 19th birthday, Heihachi announces the third King of Iron Fist tournament, believing that the high amount of martial artists present will be enough to lure Ogre, and thus Jin, and many new and old faces, would compete in the third King of Iron Fist tournament. So let's just get the basics out of the way. Tekken 3 is a 3D fighter where your goal is to completely reduce your opponent's health bar or to have the most health when time runs out. You can move forward, back, jump, crouch, and you can block. When you get knocked down, you have multiple ways of getting back up, including standing, rolling back, rolling forward, getting up with a kick, etc. The game has 4 primary attack buttons, including the left and right punch and the left and right kick buttons, and different combinations can be used for character-specific attacks and throws. And this was all the same for the first 2 games as well. However, Tekken 3 deviates from the first 2 installments by allowing you to step to the side by tapping up or down on the D-pad. And while this sounds like a little addition, it quite literally fundamentally changes how the game works. This new axis of movement allows you to deal with your opponents in a way that wasn't possible before. Some attacks that would have been hard to deal with in the previous games can now be sidestepped and punished before your opponent has a chance to recover. But some attacks you'll get hit for trying to sidestep because they hit more horizontally. The point is, it's an entirely new option which needs to be used strategically. This new axis of movement also applies for when you're on the ground, as you can now roll aside when knocked down. Just like the previous installment, there are a lot of different modes you can play, but once again we'll start with arcade mode. First, you pick one of the 10 starting roster members made of both new and returning characters. Jin Kazama, the newest Mishima who refuses to be called a Mishima, King, who's actually a different person and successor of the king from the first two games, Forest Law, the son of Martial Law, Ling Xiaoyu, Jin's classmate who has a literal panda as a bodyguard, Hwoarang, a gang member and self-appointed rival of Jin, Eddie Gordo, whose name would become synonymous with button mashers for decades, Yoshimitsu, that samurai guy who looks completely different in every installment, Nina Williams, who is cryogenically frozen so she's still in her 20s, Lei Wulong, who's investigating the recent disappearances of martial artists around the world, and Paul Phoenix, who for some reason has an ongoing rivalry with a bear. Arcade mode plays out much like it does in the previous games. You fight through 8 different stages, battling other members of the roster. Upon reaching stage 9, you fight Heihachi Mishima, who can be absolutely brutal. Like, this guy is a monster, and sometimes he just decides you don't get to play anymore. Once you beat him, you move on to stage 10, where you are confronted by the god of fighting, Ogre. The fight is broken up into 2 phases, with the first being just Ogre in his normal form, but once you take a round off him, he transforms into true Ogre. Shockingly, his true form is way easier to beat than his normal form, and I mean much easier. After beating him, you watch your character's unique ending, and are shown the credits. Just like the first 2 games, beating arcade mode with the different members of the roster is how you unlock more characters. Unlike the first 2 games, however, the unlocked characters are unlocked in a set order, and are individually tied to beating arcade mode with certain characters. Kuma 2, the son of the original bear and rival of Paul, I guess, Julia Chang, adoptive daughter of Michelle Chang, fated one day to become a streamer, Gunjack, the latest and greatest in a long-standing line of top-heavy robots, Mokujin, a living wooden training dummy who canonically is way stronger than he has any right to be, Anna Williams, who was put into cryosleep just like her sister, Brian Fury, a police officer who was killed and brought back as a very violent cyborg, Heihachi Mishima, the sponsor of the tournament and longtime villain of the story, Ogre, the god of fighting, and soon to be irrelevant villain following this game. True Ogre, who's like Ogre, but not very good. And Kazuya Mishima, just kidding, he's dead. Now pretty much all the other gameplay modes introduced in Tekken 2 also make their return here. There's Team Battle, which allows you and your opponents to assemble a team of different fighters and fight to see who can take out all the opposing team's members first. There's Time Attack, which is functionally the same as arcade mode, but now you're fighting to see how fast you can complete it. Then there's Survival Mode, where you see how many fights you can win against a legion of opponents. Each fight is 1 round, and you get a little health back each fight. Then there's a Standard Versus Mode, which allows you to play the game against another player. Practice Mode makes its return, as does the ability to look at characters' move lists, and of course, you have settings. Despite retaining pretty much all the different modes from the previous game, Tekken 3 is still able to bring in some new, and easily the most interesting modes as well. The first being Tekken Force, which turns Tekken 3 into a side-scrolling beat-em-up. The mode takes place over the course of 4 stages, being the Backstreets, the Badlands, the Darkness, and the Mishima Fortress. You go through each stage fighting different members of the Tekken Force. As enemies approach, your character locks onto them, kinda like how they would an opponent in any other mode. You can still use all your different attacks, and you can even hit multiple enemies at once if they're close enough. If you start running low on health, you can grab one of the cooked chickens that are left conveniently in your path. At the end of each stage, you fight different members of the roster, and on stage 4, you always fight Heihachi, unless you're playing Mokujin, in which case all bosses at the end of the stages will also be Mokujin. This mode can be pretty brutal at times. Sometimes it's really easy, and you just straight up one-shot most of the enemies, but sometimes they can be hyper-aggressive. Also, the bosses at the end of the stages do a lot of damage, and if you die at any point, you gotta start from level 1. Tekken 3 ain't got no time for a bunch of bubble-blowing babies. Now there's actually some progression to be had here as well. The first 3 times you beat Tekken Force, you'll be given a key. Then, on your 4th time beating it, you'll then move on to the 5th and final stage, the Underground, which is one last fight against Dr. Boskanovich, a man who for the life of him is incapable of standing up for even a few seconds. After beating him, he joins the roster as a playable character. And then we got Tekken Ball Mode, which is unlocked by beating arcade mode with all the base roster members. First, you pick the ball you'd like to use, as there are 3 different balls that determine how much damage they do on impact. Then, you and your opponent are transported to a beachside where you're basically playing a really violent version of volleyball. You hit the ball back and forth, with your goal being to hit your opponent with the ball or the ground on their side to do damage to them. The stronger the attack you hit the ball with, the more damage it does to your opponent. It may sound simple, but I swear this is one of my favorite alternate modes in any fighting game ever. Like, different attacks send the ball at different speeds and angles, and if the ball isn't hit hard enough, it'll just kind of bounce off you, which you can use to set up your next hit. And if your opponent gets too close to the center line, you can actually just hit them normally. It's sick, and it has no right being as sick as it is. Another cool little feature is that if True Ogre is one of the characters selected, you actually play Tekken Ball in a void, just like his boss fight. And another cool thing about Tekken Ball is the first time you play it, you'll actually be matched up against a little orange dinosaur by the name of Gon. He's tiny and has little hands, but he's trying. After you beat him, you unlock him as the final playable character in Tekken 3. And the last new mode in Tekken 3 isn't actually anything gameplay related, but rather theater mode, which allows you to watch all the different character endings, watch the intro, and listen to the different songs from the soundtrack as well. And that's mostly everything you can do gameplay wise, but I'd like to take a minute to talk about a few of the characters I find specifically interesting. Jin replaces his father Kazuya and has some of his and some altered versions of his moves, as they both use the Mishima style. What's cool about him is he also has some of the moves that he learned from his mother, so he's like a cross between Kazuya and Jun's moveset. Then there's Mokujin, who is functionally a souped up random. Each round he copies a different character's moveset, which means to play him well, you need to know how to play every character in the game except for Dr. Boskanovich, Gon, and True Ogre, as he can't copy them. Speaking of Dr. Boskanovich and Gon, I just want to point out that they are easily two of the weirdest characters in the series. I mentioned earlier that the Doctor had a hard time standing up, and that translates to when you're playing him as well. You are literally fighting this elderly man's failing knees more than your opponent when you play this character. And then Gon doesn't even make sense as a character in this game. Many characters' attacks won't hit him because he's too small, which is a plus for him, but also, he has virtually no range on most of his attacks. And then his moveset backs up his polarizing stature, which involves him breathing fireballs in a game where characters almost never have projectiles, he rolls around like Sonic, and he has a farting attack, which unironically is kind of a good move. Also, apparently he's the main character in a manga named after him. I just found out this existed. Overall though, Tekken 3 has a really good roster. There's lots of new faces, while still retaining many of the characters and movesets people have become acquainted with. Even though sidestepping was the biggest gameplay addition, I want to point out that the entire game feels smoother than the first two. Everything is more responsive, from actually attacking to moving your character. The game is just so much better. Oh, and the soundtrack. Oh my god, the soundtrack. It's been playing throughout the video, but I cannot stress enough how they nailed all the individual character themes for this game. Also, all the characters in this game have normal and alternate costumes, but some characters actually have unlockable costumes if you play them enough. Like Jin and Xiaoyu get their school uniforms, Anna gets an outfit made from zebra skin, and Eddie gets replaced by a completely different character known as Tiger Jackson. It's pretty cool stuff, and with all that being said, I think it's time we move on to the endings. Having just defeated Ogre, Jin is caught off guard and gunned down by the Tekken Force and Heihachi. But just as he was preparing to leave, the devil gene within Jin awakens, and he quickly disposes of the soldiers and attacks his grandfather. He then sprouts large black wings and flies away with his grandfather left watching helplessly, knowing his grandson would be an issue in years to come. Some of the other endings I like include Paul's, where right after the tournament, he gets pulled over for speeding and gets a ticket, and Mokujin, who is caught by his wife slacking from his duties and is sent packing. Tekken 3 knew what made the first two games so successful, and rather than reinventing the wheel entirely, it took the already established formula and improved it. It played better, it looked better, it sounded better. It improved on everything. And that's why over 20 years later, it is still being played and is still considered one of the best fighting games of all time. And with the success of Tekken 3, came the end of Tekken's history on the PlayStation 1. Your beautiful golden trophy shines from across the room. A week had passed, and you still couldn't believe that you had won the Tekken 3 Waffle House Invitational. You remember the events after the tournament fondly. As soon as the tournament concluded, the manager had immediately kicked you all out into the parking lot. Everyone started going home, but you quickly stopped Josh before he got in his mom's car. He saw the visible disappointment on your face and asked what was wrong. But you ignored his request and extended the trophy towards him. You knew that he had let you win and refused to accept an award that so rightfully should have been his. But he pushed it back towards you and gave you a smile. He said it had never been about the game to him. He said he'd only enter the tournament so that he might have a chance to play against you, his best friend. And he had, so he was fulfilled. You were immediately taken back. Was he saying that he'd actually been trying? And then he pointed at your heart and said that you have a warrior spirit within you, and to never lose the special thing that makes you you. Then he got in his mom's car, and they rode away. And now, you stand there, wondering where you would go from here. And then, it hits you. Beating Josh isn't enough. You want to be the greatest Tekken player of all time. You want to be admired. You want to be an opponent worthy of fear and respect. And to that goal, you would begin training. Not someday, but now. Now is the time, and this is only the beginning of your story.